A maid was cleaning the house. She was then fixing the sofa when a man arrives and greets the maid. He then asks if she was enjoying the job, and she says that job was helping her a lot, as she needed money to pay for her mother's treatment. He then says that he was noticing that she was a little down in the last few days, and she says that, because of her mother's treatment, she needed to work harder to get money and thus be able to pay for the treatment, as it was very expensive. The man then asks if she only had that job to get the money. She says yes, so he asks if all she had to get money, she got that job. She says yes, and the man then says he could look into a proposition for her. She then asks what it would be, and the man says that if she gave him a little pleasure, he could make her earn more. She then says that he had misunderstood her intentions, as she wouldn't do that kind of thing. She says that, after all, the man's wife lived in that house, but the man says that his wife was out all day and she didn't have to worry about that. The man then tells her to think about it, as he could pay a lot of money for her to do that for him, but the maid says that she was not that kind of woman and would not do those things. He then tells her to think better about her proposal, as she would not regret the outcome, and if she changed her mind, she could talk to him. He then goes away and leaves the maid thinking about what he had said, and then she is very sad about it. When she has finished her service, she leaves, and on the way, she meets the woman. The woman then greets the maid and asks if she was leaving yet. The maid says yes, because her work was over and that she needed to go to the hospital to resolve some issues there. She says that, as she had already told the woman, she needed to stay with her mother, as she was the only one who could do that. She says that her sisters were studying and that they couldn't stay with their mother in the hospital because of that. She then says that, despite everything, she was trying to help her mother, and then the woman says that she is sorry about the maid's situation. She says that if the maid needed anything, she could count on the woman. The woman then says that the next day she would need the maid to clean the outside of her house better, as it was very dusty and that this was making her son get very dirty. She then asks the maid to focus on that part the next day, and then the maid says she would do that and says goodbye to the woman. The woman then goes home and finds her husband sitting on the sofa. She then sits down next to him and asks him how his day was. He says that, despite everything, his day had been good, and asks the woman how her day had been. She then says that her day was very stressful because of everything she went through at her job, and then asked what he was doing. He said he had just sat down and was having some beer to relax. He then says that now that she had come home she could rest. She says that all she wanted most was to be able to rest, but that first she needed to talk something serious with her husband. She then says that the matter was about the maid who worked for them. The man then asks what she wanted to talk about, and then the woman says that she had just found out that the maid's mother was very sick. The man then said that the situation was very sad and that they should do something. The woman then agrees, and she says that she had thought that at that moment when the maid was in need of money to pay for her mother's treatment, they could help her with something. The man then says that they should help the maid and tells his wife that she could count on him to help her. The woman then thanks her husband and says that's why she loved him, and then she says she's going to take a shower so she can relax. Some time later, the woman was going to her work. She then says goodbye to her husband and says that she would be late, as she needed to resolve some issues at her work. The man then says that he understood and that he wished his wife good luck. She then says that the maid would leave the house clean for them and that he didn't have to worry about that. She then says goodbye to her husband and says that she would miss them, but the man says that she needn't worry about him. He then tells her to be careful in traffic, and she says she would take care of herself. The man then celebrates that he would be alone with the maid and then sits on a couch. At that moment, the maid arrives and the man goes to her. He then proceeds to ask how her mother was doing. She then asks what the man wanted, and he asks if she had already given her proposal a second thought. She says yes, but that she would deny it, because that would be a lack of respect for herself and that she didn't want to do that. He then says that she didn't need to worry about anything, because his wife would take a while to come back and that he could give her a good amount. She then leaves, but the man tells her that since she didn't want to accept his proposal, she would have to get her things and leave, because she was fired. At that moment, the maid starts begging the man, saying that she really needed that job to be able to pay for her mother's treatment, but the man says that she didn't need it enough, because she didn't want to accept her proposal. She then asks the man not to do that, but he says that when someone really needs something, that person would do anything for it. She is very sad about that, but decides to accept it, and then the man congratulates her, saying that she had made the right choice. He then asks her to accompany him to the room, and then she goes along with him. He then takes the maid to her room, and at that moment, he begins to slowly remove her clothes. After the man finishes doing what he wanted with the maid, she feels very sad about it and cannot stop crying. The man then tells her not to be like that, because everything would work out, and asks her to approach. When she doesn't, he takes her by the arm and makes her approach him. The man then tells the maid that his wife could not know about that, because if she knew, something very bad would happen to the maid. She then asks what the man's wife would think if she knew that, but the man says that his wife could never know that, and so he says that she needn't worry about her. He then takes a large sum and hands it to the maid. She asks what that was, and he says it was just a treat so she could buy her mother's medicine, and that if she wanted it, she could always have more. Days later, the maid was cleaning the house and was crying a lot. At that moment, the woman arrives and then greets the maid. She came that the maid was crying and asks if everything was okay, but the maid says that nothing was wrong. The woman then says that she had gone back to her house, as she thought that she had lost money, but that in the end she had found it. She then calls out to her husband and asks her to come into the room. He then goes to her and greets his wife with a kiss on the cheek. She then says that she needed to talk to him about something that had happened. She then pulls out a large amount of money from her purse and says that she needed to talk about it, as she had thought that she had lost that money, but she ended up finding it in the maid's things. The man then says that they should send the maid away, as he does not accept that kind of behavior in his house. The woman then asks the maid what had happened to that money. The maid then says that the woman should listen to what she has to say, as she would never do something like that. The woman then says that she could tell what happened, and at that moment, the maid says that her husband was a crazy person and that he had abused her, but the man tells her to stop lying. The maid then says that she would never do that to the woman and tells the man to tell his wife the truth. He then tells her that she was lying and that his wife should search her to see if the money was on her. The maid then says that if he didn't tell the woman the truth, she would do it. The woman then asks if the maid had any proof of what she was talking about, and the maid says yes. At this point, the man says the maid was just a liar and asks his wife to send her away. The maid then hands the woman her phone and says that the proof that she was telling the truth was on that phone. At that moment, we are shown that, at that moment when the man took advantage of the maid, she had managed to put her phone on record without the man noticing. Seeing that, the woman starts to despair and says that she couldn't believe that the man had done that inside her own home. As they fight, the maid starts crying desperately, and then the woman says that he really was a horrible person for doing that to the maid. She then slaps the man across the face, but he says it was all a lie. She then says that that day, she was going to get a lawyer so they can get a divorce so the man can't keep anything. He then asks his wife to let him explain, but she says she doesn't want to see him anymore and asks him to leave her house. The man tries to get the woman to let him explain what happened, but the woman says that if he doesn't leave her house, she will call the police, and then throws him out of the house. The maid then desperately apologizes to the woman and says that she didn't want to do that, but the woman says that she didn't need to apologize, because she knew that the man had taken advantage of the maid's mother's illness to do that to her. They then hug and the maid apologizes again to the woman and says that she would always be loyal to her and would never do anything wrong to her.